Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been 67 days since the US-Israeli war with Iran began, sending the region into chaos and sparking the most serious global energy security crisis in decades. In recent days, much media attention has focused on the Strait of Hormuz, a vital shipping lane through which 1/5 of the globe's oil and gas is transported. The implications, of course, have been far-reaching. In the UK, for example, petrol and diesel prices are near record highs. Household energy bills are set to rise. Fertilizer prices are expected to double, threatening the autumn planting season. And there is a threat of jet fuel shortages looming large on the horizon just as the summer holiday season is set to start. For the people of Iran and the region, the implications have been far more devastating, with thousands killed and injured and many more displaced. So how should we understand the situation, which continues to unfold day by day, hour by hour, and what are the geopolitical implications? To answer these questions and to help us understand the historical, political, and geopolitical context in which this crisis is unfolding, we are joined by three guests. Our expert panel today is Professor Ali Ansari from the School of History at the University of St. Andrews, Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi, Senior Lecturer also from the School of History at the University of St. Andrews, and Dr. Leyla Sayfutdinova, Senior Lecturer in the School of Social and Political Studies at the University of Glasgow. Thank you so much, all three, for joining us. So to begin, the US-Israel war with Iran has been given various and shifting justifications, from regime change to curbing its nuclear ambitions. So to begin, could you briefly outline for us, and maybe start with Ali and Siavush, and then Leyla, please do jump in. What are the origins of Iran's current government and the key events that have shaped its relationship with its neighbors, which have featured so prominently in recent weeks?
That's quite a tall order, I have to say, as an initial question, because you're asking a historian to talk about the origins of the Islamic Republic, which is which might take a bit of time. So I'll give you a very abridged version as far as and knowing full well that Siavush will be in the background there to sweep up and fill in all the gaps that I've left, which I'm sure will be many. I mean, obviously, the Islamic Republic, as a consequence of the revolution in 1979. The revolution, which turned essentially a country that was pro-Western in its dealings to one that was vigorously and vehemently anti-Western and anti-American, as well as anti-Israeli. I think it's been a deeply ideological state for much of its existence. But it has to be said that in the initial phase, certainly in the 1990s, there were moments where there was some debate as to the direction of travel that the state would take, whether it would be more of a republic or more of a sort of an Islamic autocracy. I think by 2005 onwards, in the early noughties, the direction of travel became quite clear, and it moved much more down the sort of revolutionary path than some of the adherents and most of the people, I would say, in Iran would have liked. So really, from the period of President Ahmadinejad in 2005, the country has gone down the direction of being a much more autocratic Islamic state under the guiding leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei the Senior, who obviously met an untimely end at the beginning of this war, I think on February the 28th. So there's been a deep sort of ideological antipathy between the leadership of the Islamic Republic and the West, not least Israel. And this frames the current sort of the current situation. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of devil in the detail, if I can put it that way. I mean, there's been lots of opportunities, I think, for rapprochement, détente, so on and so forth, that have been missed by both sides. I think there's plenty of blame to go around, by the way. I think you can pick and choose your moments as to when they decide to. But at the end of the day, I think, and I'll be interested to see what Siavush says of this, but at the end of the day, I think the Ayatollah Khamenei's dogma in some ways has shaped the way in which the Islamic Republic has moved forward. And he's been very, very rigid, particularly in any attempt to build a détente with the United States, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years. I would say even further than that, to be honest. But, that's really the factor. And obviously, one of the arguments was that his removal might allow for a little bit more flexibility on the leadership, but clearly in the middle of a war, I don't think that's necessarily likely. But that's the broad framework in a very abridged and somewhat summary way, which I'm sure people will be able to pick holes in. I think I'll hand over now Siavush. I'll pass the baton, if you will, to Siavush to fill in all the gaps that I missed in that rather swift narrative.
I will just pick up on what Ali was mentioning, which is, I think, very important. The extent to which Khamenei's personal perspective has shaped one of the more critical issues. So you were talking, Sean rightly mentioned at the beginning, we had a lot of shifting objectives since the start of this conflict at the end of February. In the last couple of hours, the news websites are abuzz about this potential memorandum of understanding. And at the time of coming into this event, I still didn't get an Iranian reaction to this. But the headline figure is that there is a sort of a American plan that Iran might converge on to bring this war to an end and engage in substantive negotiations. And the key issue here is, on the Iranian side, on the nuclear side, uranium enrichment. And there's mention of a moratorium of 15 years on the enrichment of uranium by Iran. So this might seem like a technical issue, and it is, of course, but the roots of it are deeply political. And it is really uranium enrichment by Iran internally is not a technical aspect of the Iranian nuclear program. It's not an essential element of it, because Iran only has one functional reactor at the moment that's being fed and controlled through Russian uranium. It was the headline element, if you want, of Ayatollah Khamenei's vision of a nuclear Iran. It was that of completing and mastering the nuclear cycle domestically. And this was a purely political decision, as I said, not a technical one. And it's interesting how energy considerations come in here. And this is really the bedrock of all the ups and downs we have seen in the past 10, 15 years in the relationship with Iran and the West. When Iran was willing to be flexible, you had the JCPOA nuclear deal. When Iran battened the hatches after Trump came out of the JCPOA in 2018, we had the sequence of events which led to the production of 60% uranium, the prices, that uranium apparently going underground. And now we've gone back to that. So the objectives are clearly not regime change anymore, not at least on the American side. It's more to do with the fate of this uranium enrichment and Trump's mantra about Iran not building a nuclear weapon. Much of this is political. Much of this was really guided by Khamenei's vision, which was not really backed, if you want, by technical considerations. With Khamenei Sr. Not in the picture anymore, of course, after the 28th of February, things could change. It is not clear really whether they will change really in this direction or not ultimately. But it also gives you the idea of the extent to which personalities matter and personal politics at the helm matters. Much is made in these weeks about resilience, themes such as resilience, the fact that the Islamic Republic has soldiered on, of course, after the initial onslaught and after repeated assassinations of its top officials. But ultimately, Iranian politics in the past 100 years, both before and after the revolution, was really built upon persons, about personalities managing to really shape the state system, far more than parties did, or far more than sort of different forms of organizations did. So we go back really to this really binding issue concerning the Iranian nuclear program, which has really been there in the background for the past couple of decades, really, since 2003, uranium enrichment. And we need to see whether Trump really solves it in a different manner, whether this 15-year moratorium that the Americans are pressing on will really happen, and the impact of that, of course, will be far-reaching. So both politically and in terms of energy and more, which we can discuss later.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Siavush. Leyla, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you very much. I think that was a really good, setting of the context. What I want to do is I want to draw attention a little bit to the northern neighbors of Iran. Obviously, most of the war activity and discussion has focused on the southern neighbors and the relationship with the West. But I think in order to really grasp the global significance of what is going on, it's also important to look to the north and to relationship with Russia and the post-Soviet Eurasia. And that And energy, very importantly, has been very central to that relationship as well for the last actually more than a century, almost probably century and a half. And for starters, the two northern Iranian neighbors, Armenia and Azerbaijan, both came into existence thanks to due to the Russian conquest in the Russo-Iranian wars. And that history, it still matters, like to this day. So the relationship with both Armenia and Azerbaijan are to a great extent still colored, but that, post-imperial, if you wish, relationship with Iran. And it's a complex web of issues, but going back specifically, and perhaps I will touch a little bit on some of that later on in the discussion, but energy has also been very important in the relationship between Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and Iran, and it still is important in the modern Russia and Iranian relationships, as well as relations between Azerbaijan and Iran and Armenia in Iran in different ways, from the labor migration to the Baku oil fields in the beginning of 20th century, to the fact that actually Soviet Union got a finally open ticket to export oil to Western Europe only after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, because until that time, the US really opposed the Soviet exports to Western Europe. And in the post-Soviet period as well, this issue of potential cooperation between Iran and Azerbaijan in the energy sector, for example, has always been on the table and was blocked in mid-90s by the United States and so on. And we have had this in the nuclear sector as well, this long-term cooperation between Russia and Iran as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think that sort of preambles where we're going next, because energy infrastructure has been a key focus of this war, whether it be drone attacks across the region or the threat of Iran's energy infrastructure. So I don't want to put it to you, what is, and I think you've alluded to this a little bit, Siavush and Leyla, but what is Iran's energy mix? How does it generate electricity for its civilian population? Is it mostly nuclear, or is it through other means? Could you highlight for our audience, what does it look like?
Shall I add something? Yeah, certainly I wouldn't say nuclear is the main thing, because clearly there's only as much electricity you can produce through a single reactor. And that's in Bushehr. It's been a very controversial reactor built over many decades, first by the West Germans, then by the Russians, and its efficiency and its ability to really produce much is under strain. I think Iran produces energy through has many other ways of producing energy. First of all, it's a country that 66% of its national territory is actually desert, or something like that. So plenty of solar power if it decides to go that route. It's a famously arid country. Tehran was about to run out of water. So there's a lot of opportunity for solar power. And of course, some of it is being exploited, but not to the extent it could be exploited. Much of it, unfortunately, is due, I think, to simple burning of fossil fuel. That's the main thing. And this has also been very controversial, because over the past few years, there has been this constant embarrassment for the government as it has had to move around, I think, electrical power plants, and also close down some of them because they were using a very polluting form of fuel called mazot. And this would cause outcries within public opinion because of its cancer, the potential, of course, of spread of cancer via its fumes, and would lead to blackouts and more. And Iran is ironically, you could argue that for all this sort of news coverage and for all this amount of time that the Iranian nuclear program has been at the center of media attention, we still go through very severe power cuts in summertime, and some of them are extremely debilitating. I remember a couple of summers ago, an acquaintance had an elderly relative in a provincial town, and this relative wasn't in a good situation, and she was that this person was calling hospitals in Tehran, asking whether they would pick up the father, and due to the power cuts, they would refuse to do it because the chances of machinery breaking down and that person dying because of that, rather than because of the care they were receiving, was very high. So these are very endemic issues that Iran has. Issues that won't be solved solely through nuclear. This has never been the case. This explanation that the Iranian nuclear program can actually solve Iran's endemic electrical issues. This is a country of 95 million people with very severe challenges with energy infrastructure. It doesn't work. So I think at the moment it's mostly through, a little bit through hydroelectric. I would say mostly through burning fossil fuels, and to some extent through solar power. It's this kind of mix which I think is in the flow. And of course, gas also helps. It's not just the mazot fossil fuel. I think it's also gas. And Iran has a lot of gas in that joint oil field with Qatar, which again is a very underdeveloped element of Iran's energy mix.
I should just say that the nuclear contribution to Iran's electricity grid is less than 2%, just to be, that's what Bushehr supplies. And it's very, very low. And as Siavush says, the idea that nuclear is going to be the solution in the immediate future is fanciful. I mean, there's no real plans for the building of new reactors, and they can't do it themselves anyway. So they'd have to get someone else to come in and partner them. So, and we're talking about a decade. I mean, it's at the very least, but I can't see that happening. So a lot of it is just fossil fuels, and of course a lot of their power plants are very old, and they are suffering from shortages, as Siavush said, of power. I mean, not just in the summer. I mean, it's been increasing. I remember in the good old days in the 1990s, we had power cuts, and people said things can only get better. They said, but as it happens, things have got much worse.
Leyla, did you want to come in at all?
Not on this one.
Okay, I think that one of the things you've highlighted, and before we shift to the larger geopolitical context and implications, I just want to take a moment to ask you, we've heard various reports about the impact of the war on the civilian population. What, from your family and friends and contacts and colleagues on the ground, what have these last 67 days been like? What have you heard from friends and colleagues there?
Shall I start already?
Yeah, you start. I think you're more in touch than I am, I think, Siavush.
Well, yes, but by a very small margin, I would say.
I know.
So first of all, obviously, the problem we face as any other Iranian is nearly 70 days of very severe internet blockage. So far, the creation of an apartheid internet system by the Iranian government, where very few people are given access, and most of the rest have to do with domestic internet. But what trickles out is, of course, the first phase in which people had to get used to the trauma of actual war, bombings, indiscriminate bombings, the lack of air sirens, increasing attacks on civilian parts of cities, of course, because that's where targets were for the Israelis and the Americans. Destruction of infrastructure and very severe consequences of civilian life, despite the fact that basic goods kept flowing. For the past few weeks after the ceasefire, something else has taken hold, I would say. First of all, is a very sharp worsening of the economic situation, which led to all sorts of things. Inflation officially acknowledged at least 70% year on year, probably higher than that. A crash of currency, the value of the real with regards to dollar, euro, and pounds on the open market, but also the impact of the blockade. Much is being made about Iran's the resilience of the political class and more, but the blockade there are very little solutions for the blockade. So one example, to cite many, the price of anything that has to do with plastics plastic wrapping. So when you go to a supermarket, the salad you buy, of course, has a plastic wrapping. The bread you buy has a plastic wrapping. The main ingredient for this plastic was coming through ships from China, of course. And the blockade hits that as well. It's not a question of just oil exports being blocked. It's also these sort of primary ingredients for Iranian industries being blocked as well, which has led to the sharp rise of any foodstuff that obviously requires plastic in its preparation or in its packaging. There is a liquidity crisis in many banks. Apparently, many banks are ordered by the Iranian central bank not to give out more than the equivalent of £20 in cash to account holders on a daily basis. So this has led to what appears to be, believe it or not, a black market for Iranian currency inside Iran. So usually black markets would be for foreign currencies, right? For dollars, for euros, for pounds. But what we are witnessing is a black market for Iranian reals inside Iran in cash. So this, of course, should exercise minds even within the establishment, right? I mean, this is a situation where the government is officially announcing that it has a damage bill from these weeks of bombings, tens of thousands of targets, as the Americans and Israelis put it, of anything between 270 to $300 billion. These are official figures, not leaked figures or media figures. So in order to, this money has to come from somewhere. And some people were claiming that this could come from the toll booth at the Strait of Hormuz. I think the most rosy estimate points to an income of something like $3 or $4 billion a year if everything went Iran's way in that regard. So that is not really much of a starter. So this is what people are contending with, and to a great extent, it is also a circumstance of people putting their life savings now for sustenance, for everyday expenses, for living, and the middle classes really going through deprivation and more. And moreover, without any real prospects, unless, of course, there is this sort of deal. And what you read in the what has been reported so far in the memorandum of understanding is the unblocking of Iranian assets, of frozen Iranian oil revenue across the world, which is, of course, now appears increasingly like a necessary lifeline to prevent a very severe, an even more severe downturn in the economy.
Ali, did you want to come in, Ali or Leyla?
No, I don't know
said everything
about the internal situation in Iran. I don't think I can comment on that.
I mean, the thing is you know, the financial crisis is pretty severe, and it comes off the back of this banking crisis, of course, that was the trigger for the protests in December, January. So, you know, a lot of this predates the war, but is just made worse by the war, if I can say. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, a lot of people seem to think, you know, Siavush and I have this quite interesting dialogue between ourselves about the number of people who think that the war has made Iran stronger. A lot of us, you know, I can't see how you would come to that conclusion. It may have made the Revolutionary Guard a little bit more bolder, but, you know, in a wartime situation, the military aspects of any regime tend to be front and center. I mean, it's not unusual. The question will be what they do if and when there is a ceasefire. You know, and that I think will be interesting. I mean, to see what happens afterwards. And our focus is almost exclusively on our own pain. You know, I think we should, you know, the level of pain threshold. I mean, our pain threshold is much lower than theirs, partly because they're not a democracy, so they can inflict much more pain, obviously, on their own population. But, you know, Iran isn't, you know, the Iranians are not so stoic or so resilient that they can resist everything. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to feed people, you know, I mean, you have to do things. And I mean, you know, there are lots of problems ahead for them, I think.
No, I think that's really helpful. I just want to invite our audience that if you have a question for our expert panel, do please pop it into the chat. You will have an opportunity to put your questions directly to the panel, either in the chat or live in just a few minutes. But now let's take a sort of shift and think about the larger geopolitical context of this. So I'm not sure who, but for those not paying attention to the US-Israel war with Iran, will have undoubtedly noticed the geopolitical implications of the war, which has rattled economies around the globe. So I just want to put to the panel, what is Iran's role in the global political economy of hydrocarbons, and what is the importance of oil and gas exports to the survival of a current government regime? This has been sort of featured in the news prominently, especially with the Strait of Hormuz. So if you could paint the picture, how does it sort of fit in regionally with the larger global economy of hydrocarbons? I'm not sure who wants to go first. It's up to you.
Well, I can go first on this
Leyla,
one,
please,
if
yes,
you like.
please.
I think I mentioned already this, kind of relationship between the Soviet Union, like the place of the interconnection, let's say, between Iran and former Soviet Union in the global energy landscape, with basically Soviet Union gaining access to consumers in the West when Iran was taken out of the picture thanks to the US sanctions. So what I think is very interesting that's happening now, and this is like in the period of petromodernity, if you like, this is the first case that we have both Russia and Iran like with significantly limited abilities to export their oil. And the fact that US is blockading the straits, and this is happening like very shortly after the takeover of Venezuela, it does create a lot of questions for me. Of course, we don't know how things are going to develop about how this kind of global landscape of oil is going to change in the future. Of course, the hope and mine as well is that there will be a faster shift towards renewable, but there is also this very different relationship of control over not just the production of oil, but also the routes and the transit of oil. And one other thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit is this old, Timothy Mitchell argument about oil being more mobile, and just thinking about compared to coal. And if you go, and I went back to the book before this discussion, I just wanted to see to which extent he considers the role of pipelines versus the role of shipping of oil. And pipelines are pretty much not in the book. And I think that is very interesting because we do, like, when we think about Middle Eastern oil, we do tend to think a lot about the, straits, about shipping, and historically also in the US, Houston, Gulf area, and so on. It was always connected to ports and shipping. But Eurasian oil system and gas delivery system, they were historically formed differently. Originally the Baku oil was also transferred to the Black Sea ports. In the Soviet period, however, what happened that Soviet Union delivered oil through pipelines directly to consumers, which was very different to the way that oil from other parts of the world is being delivered to consumers. There is usually this shipment element. It doesn't mean that there are no pipelines in Middle East. There are plenty, but they usually also bring oil to a port, like Kirkuk Ceyhan pipeline that brings the North Iraqi oil to the Mediterranean. Other pipelines that they always tend to go to the seaside. It's interesting that in the post-Soviet period, the Caspian oil also was reoriented to those maritime routes compared to the Russian oil that continued to flow mostly through pipelines. How this current two wars, because we're having two wars where oil is and gas are being weaponized, both the Russian-Ukrainian war and this current war between US and Israel and Iran. How this will change the whole landscape of oil transit in the world. This is very interesting to see, but very complicated. Yes.
Ali, Siavush?
I will add just a couple of things. So first of all, the lack of full access, if you want, to Iranian oil in the global markets has been going on for a few years. You could argue since the JCPOA. So clearly, the global markets have found a way to cope in the absence of normal Iranian exports. That is clear. This crisis is not triggered by the absence of Iranian oil into the global market. It's triggered by the obstruction of a key waterway. So if Iran goes back to a normal, in quote, system, roughly what it was, say, a couple of decades ago, where, it was exporting, I think up to 2012, more or less, where exports to Europe and more were normal, and it could repatriate funds. It will certainly just ameliorate its own economic situation, but it won't necessarily lead to a drop in the price of oil for end consumers. Because also the big development, of course, since 5 days ago is UAE coming out of OPEC, which once the Hormuz situation is solved, and once I think the measures to bypass Hormuz will be put into place, because I think the lesson that the Persian Gulf states will have learned from all of this is, find the plan B which works, and do not sit on the idea that the Strait of Hormuz will be open forever. This will, of course, lead to a very different supply perspective. I think where Iran can be competitive moving forward is gas. Gas is where Iran and Qatar have an edge, of course, with that joint gas field they have in the Persian Gulf. Iran badly needs the technology to develop that. Of course, Qatar made a very fast leap forward with technology to develop its own part of the field. Every now and then, Iran grumbles that it's basically nicking the gas from its own side because of the fact that Iran cannot do it. And that will probably be where Iran can make inroads. But again, what Leyla was pointing out is very true. It's also an issue of infrastructure. The big leap that we had in the Azeri oil industry, I think, in the past couple of decades is the infrastructure. It's the way in which now there is this very solid infrastructure that Azerbaijan has for moving its oil towards, particularly through the pipelines, and particularly, of course, through the synergy it has with Turkey. Let's not forget that. And Turkey has this very crucial pipeline host. All of this is missing from the Iranian perspective. As you see, even Iran is completely reliant still on the time, the very time-honored and going back to the early 20th century pattern of exporting through the Persian Gulf. So, as you see, this also creates problems for Iran. When a blockade is in place, for example, Iran cannot block the Strait of Hormuz and get out of it completely unscathed. So I think these are the key issues here. But we have to, again, bear in mind that with the developments in Venezuela, with UAE coming out of OPEC, once Hormuz is solved in one way or the other, Iranian oil is not so essential, I think, for the global markets as it could have been in previous decades. It's simply not a critical element which by itself can cause an oil shock in terms of supply. The oil shock comes from other things, namely, for example, interdiction of transport.
Can I just add there that I do think in the longer term that this, what Iran has done has been quite clever in the short term, but I think it's going to have lots of problems for it in the long term. I mean, I don't think any of the Arabs now will trust Iran, certainly the Islamic Republic of Iran, in terms of access to the Strait, and alternative routes will be sought. I mean, I think there's going to be real problems there. And, Iran has the Islamic Republic certainly has a terrible tendency to think that they can go to the status quo antebellum and everyone can kiss and make up and it will be fine. I think the level of animosity and distrust now, particularly between the UAE and Iran, is going to be massive. And I think many of the other Arab states as well. And if this, Siavush mentioned this sort of agreement, this memorandum of understanding that they're talking about, if that comes to fruition, I suspect it will be because the Chinese will put a lot of pressure on the Iranians to deal with it, because nobody wants this, particularly the Chinese do not want to have their supplies being cut internally. I mean, it's what Iran has basically developed is a Samson option, which is essentially that, we will bring the entire building down on top of all of us. So it's not something that I think people are going to be terribly, they don't want to leave the future of their economic development in the hands of the IRGC. It's really as simple as that. And I think that's going to change a lot of calculations going forward.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think on the back of that, you've highlighted how this conflict has disrupted sort of established relations between Iran and its regional neighbors. Have there been any new alliances that have been formed as a consequence, or is it just all broken relations at this point?
Well, I will say, sorry, very briefly to add on China point. The China point is that no matter what we think the relationship between China and Iran is, and of course today you have the foreign minister, Araghchi, received in great pomp in Beijing, it's not comparable to the relationship that China has with the United States. And I would say it's not even comparable to the relationship that China is building with many Persian Gulf countries.
With Saudi Arabia.
With Saudi Arabia. And you might have heard that China caused Iran's ire when it sided with the UAE in this long-standing dispute they have over the 3 islands, if I'm not wrong, of the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
China came out like the European Union did and many other, I think even Russia at some point, if I'm not wrong,
yeah, you're right.
siding with the UAE over the 3 islands. So much is made about Iran's turn to the east and its relationship with Russia and China, but we have to separate ceremony and performance there with actual reality on the ground. And apparently something like 10% of China's oil imports are from Iran. Remember that 90% of Iran's oil exports at the moment are towards China. But this 10% is, of course, geared towards leverage. It's not essential. I think China can get hold of that 10% from elsewhere. The reason why it does it is, of course, the sharp discounts that it gets on the one side. And on the other, the sort of leverage that gives it towards, the sort of complex barter agreement that it has in terms of payment. Because, of course, even there, it's not straightforward dollars going to Iranian coffers. It creates a lot of hassle for China as well through the teapot refineries and all that implications in terms of American sanctions. So we have to be temperate and we have to really be cautious when we read about the depth of Iran-China relations, the impact of these relations on, for example, China-US relations, China-UAE, as Ali quite rightly mentioned, China-Saudi relations. Those are quite important as well.
On the northern front, I would say that I don't see, I don't see a serious change in relations. So there were expectations and fears that Azerbaijan would get involved, and like that also to answer one of the questions in the chat because of its, close relationship with Israel. But no, Azerbaijan maintained a very strongly neutral position, not getting involved into this at all. And I mean, as I mentioned, it's a complex relationship. There are mutual grievances and complaints all the time, but still that line has been very, firm and, unwavering for Azerbaijan. And I would say also for Armenia as well. I don't see a major change in relationship with Russia either. And I mean, Turkey as well, Azerbaijan's major partner, that also maintained a very neutral position, obviously, because they want to continue to have relations with it. You don't want to, to mess with a 95 million neighbor.
Great. We're about to turn to questions from our audience. So I'm going to put one more question to our panel, then over to the audience here. So please do put your questions in the chat, or you also have a chance to put your questions live to the panel if your internet and bandwidth will let you. Also, this is being recorded, so if you missed part of the session, you'll be able to see part of it for the recording. Just to sort of press on this last bit of the Strait of Hormuz, because it's come into such sharp focus these last few weeks. And I think you've illustrated that the opening and the closing of the strait has very different implications for Iran versus the region versus the globe. But if the strait were to open tomorrow, for example, how would we expect things to change for Iran and for the region? Would things, presumably they wouldn't return to normal, and presumably Iran has now been changed forever, both in terms of its exporting regime, in terms of its energy regime. What would happen? So theoretically, if it were to open tomorrow, what would it look like in Iran? What would be the perspectives for the future?
Who wants to go? Shall I say something? So, first of all, I think closure of the Strait of Hormuz had been waived as a threat, as a consequence of any substantial military action against Iran for decades, actually. I think you can go back a solid 20 years. So you could argue that the Persian Gulf states sat on it as a rhetorical threat for many years. Now they will have to think about a real plan B if this happens again. Even if it opens up, and even if this logjam of all these hundreds, if not thousands of ships clears up, there's talk about long recovery, but there'll have to be a plan B. I don't think they will simply trust Iran's word that it's all finished yet. Then other countries, of course, will have to revisit their relations with Iran. The UAE, as we know, is a great haven for all sorts of nice and not so nice financial operations. We all knew that the Iranians and parts of the Iranian state were heavily invested in business operations. There's talk of even hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Iranian assets in Dubai. We'll have to see what happens to them as well. On the Iranian side, this will lead probably to some political infighting, because the Iranian parliament is still going through the motions of a law, actually, mandating the setup of tolls through the Strait of Hormuz and charging everybody to go through it. And of course, this stands in great contrast with what we've been hearing since this morning about the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which doesn't appear to be associated to any tolls. So the people who are calling for that will face a reckoning, and there will be some form of internal political confrontation. However, this precedent of some precedents have been set here, and I think some red lines have been crossed, particularly in terms of the attack that we saw on infrastructure across the Persian Gulf. Iran keeps justifying it by saying that this was all attacks against American infrastructure, but clearly we saw a lot of attacks on oil installations and more. And this, I agree with what Ali was saying earlier, this will cast a long shadow, I think, on relations in the region. And it will be a very, very fraught and very, very difficult and nervous recovery after this incident. I think this has created a lot of aggravation that you will see in the long term. And as I said, potential economic implications for Iran as well, if its relationship with certain parties, such as the United Arab Emirates, is changed considerably as a consequence of this conflict. Ali, please.
I mean, I think just to add to that, I mean, I think, when we get to the business of reparations, I think it'll be very, very difficult for Iran to secure reparations per se. I mean, it's obviously looking for sanctions relief. My element of caution about that is that actually getting sanctions relief is extremely complicated, by the way. I mean, it's much more complicated than I think even Trump thinks. The way in which the sanctions were layered in America were basically designed so they can't be lifted. Essentially, it's the way they're designed. So this would be a slow process. It would need Congress on board. It would need all sorts of things to facilitate that. And I notice in the way in which the leaks, shall we say, and we have to be cautious about these leaks because it's not the first time this particular outlet has brought stuff out. Says it will be a gradual lifting of sanctions. I bet it will. I mean, I think it'd be a very gradual lifting of sanctions. And I think this raises problems for Iran, of course, because Iran wants an instant fix. I mean, it needs an instant fix and it wants to show a tremendous success. And of course, it didn't do very well out of the JCPOA, so it'll want a lot of assurances. So we'll get a certain amount of releasing of blocked assets. That's fine. But this is basically a sticking plaster for the economy, which is in a real mess. So it's going to be very difficult for it. And I think, as Siavush quite rightly says, I think there'll be a lot of infighting actually over this, because there's all sorts of idealistic mumbo jumbo that goes on in Iran, and they sort of think that they can, achieve this great victory and it will all be instant and everyone will be happy, going forward. In terms of, the UAE, by the way, I suspect the UAE will say that they will seize certain amounts of assets, certainly state assets, Iranian state assets, if they are in the UAE, for their own reparations, actually, for their own compensation for the destruction done to their facilities. I mean, you have to remember that the UAE was the most attacked of any, actually, of the, even Israel didn't come under attack on the same scale that the UAE did. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation to be in, particularly when you realize that Dubai was the one outlet, actually, for the Iranians to sort out their finances and do a lot of their sort of, how should we say, under the boards trading and this sort of thing. The idea, by the way, that the UAE will be replaced by Pakistan is also fanciful. I mean, it's just a fantasy. I mean, some people sort of come out with this idea that there was going to be sort of rail. I mean, they're going to develop some sort of rail network and start shipping stuff out. I mean, do people actually understand what the extent of the rail network in Iran is at the moment? I mean, they would have to build the rail network. I mean, it's not going to happen so easily. So I think, again, there are a lot of questions that will need to be asked. And if any of these facts that are coming out, or any of these suggestions of this agreement, this MOU is for real, particularly as Siavush says about the export of the enriched uranium, which they refused to do initially, but also the fact that they're not going to have tolls on the straits, which I'm sure the Chinese and others have said to them, you can't do it. I think there will be lots of questions asked in Iran about, the costs they have borne to achieve what, really. I mean, I'm sure there'll be questions in America too, by the way, but I suspect at the end of the day, actually, we ought to pay attention also to the questions that will be asked in Iran, because the damage there in Iran is immense. I mean, let's not forget there were 30,000 sorties. I mean, 30,000 sorties. It's a lot of this has been disguised, I have to say, in some of the narratives that are coming out of Iran. But I suspect when the dust settles, they've seen their steel plants destroyed. They've seen their petrochemical plants severely damaged. A lot of their exports in key areas will take years to recover. I mean, just as it will for the Qataris and others and the Kuwaitis who are also struggling to recover on some of their own petrochemical and oil facilities. So there are no quick fixes here. And I think there are no quick fixes either economically, politically, or even ideologically. And I think that will be interesting to see how the regime in Iran copes with that.
I want to draw a comparison between Ukraine and Iran in this case because of this, the transit weapon, and this is a very limited weapon. You can use transit as leverage quite effectively for many years. But if you actually start to use it to weaponize it and use it to its full power, that's pretty much it. You can do it once. After that, the trust is broken or the infrastructure is broken. The people find other transit routes, and that basically you lose the leverage. So Ukraine behaved, of course, it's very different situation. But these pipelines that went through Ukraine, actually oil is still transited through Ukraine to some extent. Ukraine really positioned itself as this very responsible transition country, and so on and so forth. But the gas stopped, the Russian gas no longer flows from Ukraine. The oil will probably stop in 2029, and that's it. The Ukraine no longer has that leverage over Russia anymore. And a similar thing I think may happen also in Hormuz, because once Iran has deployed this weapon to its full power, people will no longer want to use that transit route. And what do you do with it now? So I think there is now an effort to keep that weapon still, to keep the leverage. We will see how successful it will be, or whether people will indeed start to make alternative routes that bypass Hormuz, and how successful that will be. But it's hard to say, of course, right now, because it's not resolved.